friends in Reading who are looking at what it means to develop a Christ-centred community in their local area, and we're really excited to see how that develops. And the Reading group is just one of endless new opportunities that might come out of this. So we'd like to stay in touch. As things start to open up again, we'd like to make sure that we continue the good things that we've developed over the last year. And we'd like to explore how we can continue to grow this community, both online and maybe in person. So if you'd like to hear more about Oasis and our theology, or if you'd like to continue to get to know this online community that you've become part of because you feel like you're on your own in your area, or if you think that there might just be a few of you who are up for exploring what it means to create your own inclusive, progressive church community focused on following the example of Jesus and building a community movement which brings people together. Or if you're a church leader and you'd like to do what the church in Bath did and become Oasis Church wherever you are, please get in touch. Thank you to every one of you who has joined us on this journey. Every Sunday over the last year, we've made the Global Gathering our home. It isn't time to move on yet, but we want to make sure that what we've built here doesn't end when restrictions end. But instead, we want this to be the start of something new, something radical, something transformational. If you'd like to join us on that journey, sign up at oasiswaterloo.org/global.
Thanks, Nath. We want to take a moment to say a huge thank you to Nath from every one of us. He's tirelessly spent the last year making our global gatherings, with many, many, many hours of editing, creating sermon series ideas, providing filming tips, and all this alongside his other responsibilities looking after the Waterloo hub, and for much of that time running in-person services as well as the global gatherings. So thank you, Nath, for the perseverance, patience, love and energy you've given to creating a space for us to gather together. This week we'll be hearing from Jill on the final part of our series, Nevertheless, She Persisted, highlighting the stories of incredible women from the Bible and thinking about what these stories speak to us in the present moment. It's turned out to be an apt time to hold this series. In a month where we've celebrated International Women's Day and Mothering Sunday, days that should have been celebrating women, they've been overshadowed by the disappearance and the death of Sarah Everard, and the many stories that followed in the wake of this, of the fear and violence that women still live with on a daily basis. So as we draw to the end of this series, our task as the church must be to create spaces where women are believed, listened to, feel safe and can be free to lead. We would do well to remember that this task is not complete. The pain of the women in the stories we've explored has resonance to the present suffering of women everywhere. We're talking across Oasis about how we carry this work forward and how we keep moving towards a world where everyone is able to thrive without fear. If you'd like to know more about what we're doing, please do get in touch. Now we're going to have our Bible reading and then we'll hear from Jill.
This week's reading is taken from Mark 5, verses 25 to 34. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realised that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see, the people crowding against you," his disciple answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering."
Hi, my name's Jill Rowe and I'm the Ethos and Formation Director for Oasis, and I'm a volunteer on the leadership team at Oasis Waterloo. The other day I was out on one of my lockdown exercise walks and I stopped briefly to look at something in front of a house. My back was turned to the road and there was quite a bit of noise coming from the street. As I turned round, I was confronted by a long wheelbase transit van being reversed into the driveway that I was standing in, and it wasn't slowing down. I was being driven into, so I started to call out. The van did hit me, not badly, but it did hit me. So of course I started hitting on the back of the van as hard as I could, which thankfully was now reversing a little bit more slowly. And then it stopped, thank goodness. I stepped over a pile of rubble and some massive building sacks in the corner that I'd been pinned into, so that I could speak to the driver. It would be fair to say that I was a little shaken. Why hadn't he seen me? Why hadn't he heard me? It's not like I'm small. "What are you doing?" I said to him. "Sorry, love, I didn't see you. I didn't hear you. I didn't see you. I didn't hear you." Over the past few weeks, we've listened to talks about various women mentioned in the Bible. Much of what has been said has been about women whose stories we didn't know, we hadn't seen them. But as these stories have been uncovered, we've learned so much. And today we're looking at another story. And this is the final one in this series that we've called Nevertheless She Persisted. In the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke, we come across this encounter of Jesus with this woman who's been hemorrhaging blood for 12 years. Now at that time, such a medical condition meant that you were deemed unclean, and to be unclean was to be untouchable. So this woman found herself thrown to the very edges of society and utterly rejected. This is the story of an outsider, a marginalised woman, a person who was actually forced into silence. She would have been thrown out by her family and left with no means of support. She was beyond the arms of welfare, and she was unable to participate in her faith tradition. It's likely that she actually lived outside the walls of the town along with the other outcasts. Her situation was desperate. She'd been ripped off by doctors and quacks, and she was down to her last ounce of hope. And then we get this account of her seeking out Jesus. I always picture this woman cloaked up, knowing full well that if she is seen and recognised, if she is spotted, then her life was done. So she carefully but deliberately risks everything to get within touching distance of Jesus. Now, within the Jewish tradition, there was a long-held belief that the Messiah would come with healing in his wings, that even his garment would somehow be holy and bring hope and wholeness. Can you imagine this? She comes up behind Jesus, reaching out her hand to touch him, her final hope. She would have been surrounded by others. I imagine her arm kind of reaching through the crowd. If only I could reach him. And she does. She touches his cloak. She touched his garment, and she notices straight away that her bleeding has stopped. And Jesus felt power go out from him. And so he turns round and asks who touched him. Imagine being that woman in that moment. The fear of being found out and being called out. What was happening with the disciples when all of this was unfolding? Let's be honest, there's something intoxicating about being around a person who is popular, and the disciples were probably feeling that as the crowd were pressing in on Jesus. They were trying to hold the line and may have been feeling pretty chuffed that they were actually there in the melee, being noticed and with the man of the moment. So when Jesus asked who touched him, the disciples are like, of course someone touched you. Look at the crowd. Come on, Jesus. Who touched you is a crazy question to ask. But Jesus persisted. And the woman steps forward. There she is, cloaked from head to toe, hunched over, carrying the pain of her marginalisation. The years of being told that she is unacceptable. And she steps forward and falls at the feet of Jesus and tells her story. Her silence is broken. Her story is being told. And then Jesus speaks. Daughter, daughter, daughter. Daughter is a status statement. It is a declaration of belonging and connection. A daughter is not a nobody. She belongs. She's part of something. She's loved. She's cherished. And Jesus sets her free and sends her in peace. This encounter is so rich with meaning. When we read stories in the Bible, it's interesting to think about whose story we are standing in as we read it. Are we reading things from the viewpoint of the person who holds the power, the position, the status, the included, the acceptable, the status holders? Or do we automatically assume we are the disempowered? Do we read things from the viewpoint of the people who are excluded, the unacceptable person in need of being rescued by Jesus? Every time I've come to this story, I've imagined being that woman and felt deeply her encounter with Jesus. I've sought to sit in the position of the victim, the one in need of being rescued, the excluded one, making an assumption that I'm that person and that is somehow how God is speaking to me. Now, sometimes that is true. I need to encounter God in that way. But what if we need to take a different position sometimes too? The one of being the people in the story with the power and the higher status or position. Let's be honest, we can have a bit of a personal blind spot when it comes to realising that we do hold power, we do have agency, we do have status. What is God asking us to do in this story today? This is a much more disruptive approach. And remember that disruption is uncomfortable. It has to be. It's how we grow and learn and develop. It's how we move forward in health and wholeness. It's how we realise we need to do some work on our interior lives. Disruption invites us to be curious and not defensive. And there is so much defensiveness at the moment, a refusal to listen and understand to the stories of others. But disruption, holy disruption, invites us to reflect rather than deflect. So let's relook at the story and notice the way that Jesus acts. He's the one with position, with status, with power. And I believe that in this encounter, Jesus is showing us how we should and can use the status, position and power that we have too. Jesus knows that somebody has touched his garment, but the disciples are so dismissive of his question. Surely it doesn't matter, Jesus. That's a daft question to ask, but Jesus persisted. Firstly, he seeks out the woman so that she is no longer hidden. He brings her to the centre. Others had to get out of the way to make space for her. Jesus brought her into the centre so that her story could be told. There's something in there about us needing to get out of the way and invite other people, the excluded and rejected, to take up the space that we have dominated. And Jesus doesn't invite her to stand there alone. He stands alongside her, shoulder to shoulder. Can you feel the strength in that? The kinship, the belonging, the protection, the value being poured out on her. Secondly, this woman existed in a culture where her voice was silenced, but Jesus amplifies her voice. He invites her to tell her story. He doesn't interrupt her or qualify what she is saying. He doesn't put his spin on it. He listens, and she pours it out, all of it. Pipe down, keep quiet. Excuse me, Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking. I can't breathe. There are echoes all around us today of people, particular people whose voices are not heard, whose voices are silenced. Who are the silenced, whose voices we need to amplify? The abused, the victims of domestic violence, the trafficked, those who are forgotten, the widows, the orphans, the refugees, those whose voices we're simply not hearing, those who are told to pipe down. We need to invite them to the centre so that they can tell their story. And our job is to provide kinship and to listen. Really listen, not simply be preparing what we are going to say next as we wait for them to finish. Our task is to amplify their voices, not ours. And finally, Jesus calls this woman daughter. This is an everything moment. It's the moment where she knows that she belongs. She's not a her or she. It's not that woman. It's daughter. Daughter. Jesus names her. Names matter. We see it when the names of those who have lost their lives to COVID are used, rather than using a barrage of statistics where people's identities are lost, or in social media campaigns for justice in the face of the murder of people like Breonna Taylor or George Floyd in America, where the hashtag is say their names, or the recent video of Jess Phillips MP reading aloud the names of all the women killed in the UK by men who have been convicted and charged as their perpetrator. Names matter. We know it ourselves. Hearing our names means something. Stuart, Rachel, Andrew, Diane, Daniel, Emily, Peter, Rahil, Jake, Fred, Kasua, Tim, Sarah. We stop being a nobody when we hear our name. We become a somebody. Jesus persisted, and so must we. We must seek out the story of those who've been kicked to the margins of society and treated as worthless and of no value. We must amplify the voices of those who've been silenced by injustice. And we must know and say their names. Why? Because it shifts something in us. It tells us clearly and loudly that we really are our brothers and sisters' keepers. Can't you see me? Can't you hear me? Jesus persisted, and so must we.
Thanks, Jill. Let's take a moment to stop and to reflect on what we've heard before we pray together. I wonder what our personal blind spots are. How can we acknowledge them and allow them to disrupt and change us. I wonder how we could amplify the voice of someone who's been silenced in the coming week. How can we create space and really listen, really give up power? I wonder where we can invite others to step into a space that we've dominated. Or if we have been excluded from a space or silenced, I wonder how we can find the courage to stand up and say, I'm speaking. As Jill said, Jesus persisted, and so must we. Let's pray together, a prayer written by Reverend Carla Miller. Disturbing God, your generosity of grace knows no bounds. It is unfathomable in depth, immeasurable in breadth. You disturb us, provoke us, challenge us to do the same, to offer our resources, our gifts, our passions, to make right relations, to feed the hungry, to resist evil, and to stand for justice, to work for dignity for all. We pray that you soften our hearts and open us wider to serve you with energy and imagination. Amen. That's almost it for this week. If you've enjoyed our Nevertheless She Persisted series and would like to hear some more from a few of our speakers about their learning and personal experience, we will have a podcast coming out next weekend. We'll be posting on our social media channels to let you know when it's live. And next week on our global gathering, we'll be beginning our new series, The Last Words and the Words After That, looking at the Easter story. For now, we're going to end with a song, and we'll see you next week.
Worthy of every song we could ever sing, worthy of all the praise we could ever bring, worthy of every breath we could ever breathe, we live for you. Jesus, a name above every other name. Jesus, the only one I could ever say.